final ship to the undying lands waits at the Grey Havens, but Elrond does not board. His hand rests on the white wood of the hull as he makes a choice that will echo through the ages. He turns his back on his own peace, on his chance to escape the slow fading of the elves, all for one desperate purpose. He must find Celebrimbor, the master smith who abandoned the great voyage. To seek the lost is to risk becoming lost yourself, and Elrond's quest risks not only his spirit, but the very hope of his people. By the end of this tale, you will understand the true cost of a legacy and the light that can be born from absolute sacrifice. What secret could be worth forsaking paradise? Wherever you are in the world right now, and whatever the hour, I would love to know what brings you to this story today. The answers lie beyond the shore, in the growing shadows of a world the elves are leaving behind. What would you be willing to lose for a chance at redemption? The sea's song was a tangible thing, a melody of peace woven into the very air of the Grey Havens. To resist it was a physical ache, a tearing of the soul. Elrond did not ask for volunteers from the main host of elves, their eyes already fixed on the horizon. Instead, he sought out two whose hearts he knew were still partly anchored to the world they were leaving. Galdor the mariner, whose hands knew the grain of every ship's wheel, and Lindir the lore master, keeper of songs and histories that even the sea might one day forget. He spoke to them not of a grand adventure, but of a debt unpaid. He spoke of Celebrimbor, the greatest smith of their age, who had vanished not into shadow, but into silence. He convinced them that some legacies were too vital to be abandoned, even for the promise of eternal peace. A palpable unease settled over their small company as the last crate of supplies was loaded. It was a fracture in the final, perfect tranquility of the elves, a crack through which the cold dread of the unknown began to seep. You could see it in the way the other elves averted their gaze, in the strained silence that replaced the usual music of departure. The conflict was clear, a quiet war between duty and desire. Galdor's hand trembled on the rail, and Lindir's voice, usually so full of verse, fell to a whisper. They had accepted the call, but the cost was now a living thing among them. Standing at the helm, Elrond faced his most perilous choice yet. Should he bind them to this path with the full, terrifying truth? Should he speak of the whispers that Celebrimbor had not merely withdrawn, but was seeking something forbidden, a power to undo the fading of their kind that might instead accelerate it? To tell them would seal their fate as completely as his own, burdening them with a knowledge that could shatter their spirits. But to withhold the truth was to make them companions in a blindness that could lead to ruin. His decision would either forge a company of unwavering resolve or plant a seed of doubt that could destroy them all. He watched as the ship's prow, which had moments before been aimed at the golden sunset, turned slowly, pointing instead toward the dark, shadowed silhouette of the eastern shore. The eastern shore was a scar upon the earth, where the Grey Havens had shimmered with ethereal light. The land of a region lay choked in silence and ruin. Their ship scraped against a skeletal pier, the wood groaning a protest after so many ages of disuse. Galdor secured the lines with a grimace, his mariner's soul recoiling from the stillness of this dead port. The air itself felt thin, as if the very magic that had once sustained this place had been siphoned away, leaving only a hollow echo. Lindir, his face pale, immediately began tracing the faint, crumbling runes on a nearby archway, his fingers brushing dust from stories of a glory long turned to ash. This was not a journey of rediscovery, but a walk through a graveyard. The further they ventured from the shore, the more the land seemed to resist them. Trees grew in twisted, agonized shapes, their branches clawing at a perpetually twilit sky. Paths that should have been straight dissolved into confusing spirals, and the very ground under their feet felt unstable, as if the memory of a great and terrible power had warped the substance of the world itself. It was Galdor who first sensed the presence, a cold spot in the air that moved against the wind. From the mists between two fallen pillars, a form coalesced. It was not a creature of flesh, but a specter of pure, sorrowful rage, a lingering echo of an elf who had fallen defending this land and could not find rest. It held a shimmering, insubstantial blade, and its silent scream was a pressure in their minds. Lindir, lost in the translation of a crucial runestone, did not see it advance. The spectral sword passed through his raised arm, not with a cut, but with a searing cold that left no blood, only a spreading numbness and a web of pale, ghostly light etched into his skin. He cried out, collapsing against the cold stone, his body shivering uncontrollably. The conflict was immediate and terrible. Galdor stood with his own sword drawn, though he knew steel was useless here. To press forward was to find the clue they desperately needed. To turn back was to save their companion, but at the cost of their entire purpose. Elrond's choice was made in a heartbeat. He knelt beside Lindir, his own face a mask of pained resolve. He placed his hands over the wound, and a soft, silver light began to emanate from his palms. This was no simple healing. It was a battle of wills, a direct transfer of his own innate spirit, his vital energy, into Lindir to push back the necrotic magic. As the ghostly web on Lindir's arm faded, a visible weariness settled into Elrond's own frame. The vibrant light in his eyes dimmed, and for a moment he looked every bit his countless years. The cost was a piece of his own fading strength, a precious reserve he could not afford to lose. Gasping, but lucid, Lindir pointed a trembling finger to the runestone he had been studying. The symbols, now clear, did not speak of a hidden refuge or a final stand. They spoke of a road, a cold road leading north, into lands where the stars themselves were said to be afraid to shine. The clue was found, but the price of it now walked with them in Elrond's weary step. The cold road north led only to the teeth of the mountains. The misty mountains were a wall of jagged stone and perpetual cloud, a place where the wind howled with a voice of its own. Their grace was a liability here, on narrow ledges of ice and crumbling rock, where a single misstep meant a fall into echoing darkness. Galdor led the way, his mariner's instincts adapted to the treacherous stone, while Elrond supported a still weakened Lindir. They moved not as mighty lords of the Eldar, but as fugitives, small and exposed against the immense, uncaring peaks. It was in a high pass, a natural choke point of towering granite, that the ambush came. They were not orcs, with their crude industry of war, but a remnant tribe of goblins, smaller and fouler, bred for the deep dark. They swarmed from fissures in the rock like insects, their forms a blur of pale skin and rusted iron. Their attack was not a battle line, but a chaotic, screeching tide of sheer brutality. The elves' fluid swordsmanship, a dance of parries and precise strikes, was brutally tested against the goblin's wild, hacking blows and overwhelming numbers. It was a conflict of essences, ancient wisdom, and refined skill, pitted against primal savagery. Galdor fought with a ferocity born of the sea, his blade a whirlwind, but a heavy iron hook caught his pack, tearing it open. From within tumbled his most precious belonging, a small, flawless crystal that housed a single, captured star. It was an ancient elven artifact, a guiding light for the darkest seas, and its sudden gleam in the gloom sent the goblins into a frenzy of covetous shrieks. The battle narrowed, becoming a desperate struggle not for survival, but for possession. Elrond saw the trap closing. To fight on was to be buried under their numbers, to lose the star and their lives. His choice was a fracture in his own resolve. He could not reveal the full measure of his power. Not here, not now, but a flicker was all he had. He slammed his hands onto the stone of the past. A flash of pure, white light erupted from him, not a weapon, but a burst of raw, disorienting power. It was a silent, concussive wave that did not burn, but blinded and stunned, forcing the goblins to recoil with pained cries. In that single, brilliant moment, the elves broke through the line and fled down the mountain. The immediate peril was over, but the cost was profound. That flash was a beacon in the unseen world, a ripple in the fabric of the land that darker, more attentive things would have felt. They were no longer just seekers in the shadows. They had announced themselves. As they stumbled into the relative shelter of the foothills, the echoes of clashing steel faded, replaced by a new, more profound silence, the quiet of being watched. The silence of the foothills was a false comfort, a fragile peace that pushed them toward the only shelter the land offered, the gnarled eaves of the old forest. Here, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient sleep, and the trees watched with a deep, rooted consciousness. It was a place outside of time, where their hurried footsteps felt like an insult. They did not find a path so much as the forest allowed them to pass, the branches shifting to block their way one moment, and opening a narrow corridor the next, until they stood in a small clearing before a being who was more tree than person. Brighalad the Ent was a tower of weathered bark and deep, patient eyes, his voice the slow creak of a mighty bough in the wind. He was a guardian of histories, so old even the elves had forgotten them, and he regarded the three travelers with a gaze that weighed the haste in their souls. To earn his trust was a battle of a different kind, fought not with swords but with words, and their greatest enemy was their own urgency. Brighalad's questions unfolded over hours, each one a deliberate, probing route. He asked not of their quest, but of their sorrows. Lindir spoke of the songs lost to the sea, his voice trembling with the memory of melodies that would never be sung again. Galdor confessed the ache of a mariner with no shore to seek, his spirit adrift in a world that was closing its doors. The conflict was palpable, a chasm between their desperate, linear race against time and the Ent's circular, timeless understanding of the world. Elrond saw that words of diplomacy or command were useless here. Only a raw, unvarnished truth would bridge the divide. His decision was a quiet surrender. He stepped forward and began to speak, not as a lord or a herald, but as a son. He shared a memory he had guarded for millennia, the private, piercing loss of his parents, his father choosing a desperate voyage into the void, and his mother fading into the starlit sea. He described the hollow it had left in him, a void that no ring of power or title of lord could ever fill. It was a vulnerability that stripped him of all authority, laying bare the very core of his grief. As he spoke, the forest seemed to lean in, the rustling leaves growing still. Brigalad's deep, mossy eyes softened, and in that shared moment of profound loss, a fragile alliance was forged. The ancient Ent's voice, when it came, rumbled with a new gravity. He revealed that Celebrimbor had come to him long ago, not as a fugitive seeking to hide, but as a visionary gripped by a final, desperate hope. The great smith sought not to preserve the old, but to create something entirely new. He spoke of forging a refuge not of stone or ring lore, but of spirit itself. Brigalad called it a Silmaril of spirit, a sanctuary for the fading consciousness of the elven people, a place where their memories and essence could endure even as their physical forms dissipated from the world. It was a hope so audacious it bordered on madness, an attempt to cheat the fundamental destiny of their kind. With this revelation, the very atmosphere of the old forest shifted. The trees themselves seemed to stir, their branches gently pointing, their roots subtly guiding, no longer as wary sentinels, but as reluctant participants, directing the elves toward the unimaginable source of this last, desperate hope. The path the old forest granted was a straight, sorrowful line to a field of shattered marble and forgotten glory. This was the grave of Gondolin, the hidden city, where the very stones seemed to weep. An oppressive silence hung over the broken towers, a quiet that was not empty, but thick with unresolved grief. Then the whispers began, not in the air, but in their own minds, a chorus of ancient accusations. The ghosts that rose from the ruins were not specters of rage, but of profound disappointment, their forms flickering with the light of an oath sworn and then broken by Elrond's own ancestors. They did not attack with weapons, but with memories, each phantom holding up a mirror to the soul. Galdor was tormented by visions of ships he had guided that were lost to storms, their crews crying out from the depths. Lindir was haunted by melodies he had failed to transcribe, the lost songs screaming in a silent, endless loop. This was a psychological siege, a battle fought not on the plains of Gondolin, but within the deepest chambers of their own hearts. The conflict was a terrifying internal one, pitting their present resolve against the crushing weight of every past failure. Their quest, their very purpose, began to feel like an arrogant delusion in the face of such timeless sorrow. Elrond watched his companions falter, their spirits crumbling under the assault. He saw that no word of encouragement, no lordly command, could break this curse. The spirits were not demanding a fight, but a confession. His choice was one of absolute humility. He stepped forward into the center of the spectral host, and he did not speak of his own deeds or his noble titles. Instead, he openly bore the weight of his lineage's sins. He gave voice to the betrayal of Miglin, whose treachery had doomed the city. He acknowledged the pride of Turgon, who had refused to abandon his beautiful, damned kingdom. He claimed these failures as his own inheritance, a blood debt that he, as a descendant, had come to acknowledge and atone for. He did not ask for forgiveness, only for the right to carry the burden forward, so that such beauty and such failure would not be the final chapter of their people. As he spoke, a profound calm settled over the plains. The vengeful spirits, their grief finally witnessed and acknowledged, did not vanish in anger, but faded like a sigh of release, their forms dissolving into motes of gentle light that rose toward the stars. The consequence for Elrond was immediate and severe. The act of absorbing that ancestral shame, of making himself a vessel for so much collective failing, drained him further. The vibrant light that had once haloed him now guttered like a dying candle, and he leaned heavily on his staff, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to have no bottom. The path ahead was now clear, a road leading east marked by a single, standing stone. But the victory had proven the quest was a battle for their very souls, and their leader was paying the price in pieces of his own. The standing stone marked not a path, but a precipice. Before them, the colossal peaks of the misty mountains rose once more and set into the living rock were the gates of Moria. But these were not doors of simple stone and iron. They were a masterwork of dwarven craft, two immense slabs of gray rock, so perfectly fitted they seemed a single surface, and across them flowed intricate patterns of runes that pulsed with a faint, metallic light. There was no handle, no lock, no visible seam. The only way forward was a song. The runes formed a musical score of impossible complexity, a harmony meant for multiple voices, a puzzle in melody that the dwarves had created in an age of friendship with the elves. To fail was not to face a monster, but to be met with permanent, silent rejection. The doors would remain sealed, and with them, any hope of finding Celebrimbor. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing their already frayed spirits. They were three, and the song demanded perfect unity. Lindir, the lore master, understood the theory, his eyes tracing the flowing script, but his voice was still weak, trembling from his spectral wound. Elrond possessed the power, but his spirit was so depleted. His own inner music was faint and out of tune. The conflict was immediate and absolute. Their survival, their very unity, depended on a perfect act of trust and harmony, and they were fractured, weary, and broken. Elrond's gaze fell upon Galdor, the mariner, a man of the wind and the wave, of shouted shanties and the creak of rigging. He had never led a song of power. His was a world of salt and spray, not of subtle harmonies. Yet, in that moment of impossible choice, Elrond saw not a sailor, but the one soul among them whose heart still beat with a steady, unwavering rhythm. He gave a single, slow nod. The weight of the quest settled onto Galdor's shoulders. He closed his eyes, not looking at the runes, but listening for the rhythm beneath them. He found it not in the memory of elven choirs, but in the crash of waves on a distant shore, in the pull of the tide, in the deep, resonant hum of a ship cutting through a midnight sea. He began to sing, his voice a low, rolling baritone that held no ethereal beauty, only raw, grounded strength. It was the foundation. Lindir, inspired, found a thread of melody, weaving his fragile voice around Galdor's steady tone like a climber grasping a strong rope. And Elrond, with a final reserve of will, added a third, higher harmony, a silvery thread of light that bound their three distinct voices into one. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep, resonant hum emanated from the stone itself. The metallic runes blazed with a warm, golden light. With a sound like a mountain waking from sleep, the immense doors groaned inwards, splitting down the center and swinging open without a touch. They stood at the threshold of a vast, swallowing darkness. A cold draft, smelling of deep stone and ages of dust, flowed out to greet them, a chilling breath from the depths that beckoned them inward to whatever answers or terrors lay within. The darkness of Khazad-dûm was not a mere absence of light, but a physical substance, thick and cold and ancient. It swallowed the meager glow from their own spirits, the faint silver light that was the birthright of the High Elves, reducing it to a dim shimmer that illuminated only a few paces of the monumental, empty hall they now traversed. They moved in a tiny, fragile bubble of illumination, surrounded by an ocean of black. The air was heavy with the smell of old stone and a profound silence, a quiet so deep it felt like a held breath. Every footstep, every whisper, echoed into a void that seemed to listen. The feeling of a watching presence was a constant pressure against their skin, a sense of vast, slumbering awareness in the mountain's heart. They were insects crawling through a sleeping giant. The path was a treacherous maze of carved archways and bottomless chasms, bridged by narrow stone spans. Galdor, his mariner's senses useless in this stagnant air, tested each flagstone with the pommel of his sword, his every instinct screaming of hidden dangers. It was he who felt the slight give in the floor, a subtle shift that was their only warning. He shouted a halt, but it was too late. Lindir, his focus divided between the path and the haunting memories of Gondolin, had stepped just a fraction too far. A deep, grinding click echoed through the hall, a sound of ancient machinery awakening. From the darkness above, a net of woven, unbreakable dwarven steel fell upon them, not to capture, but to smother. It was designed to extinguish. As the metallic mesh settled over their small company, it did not cut or bind, but it drank the light from them. The silver glow that emanated from their bodies flickered, fought, and then was violently quenched. The consequence was immediate and absolute. The bubble of light vanished. They were plunged into a blackness so complete it was a physical blow, a suffocating blanket that robbed them of sight, of direction, of all points of reference. Fear, cold and sharp, closed around them in the dark. To press forward was to walk blind into a labyrinth of certain death. To remain still was to be entombed alive in the endless night. In that terrifying silence, broken only by their own ragged breathing, a new conflict ignited. It was a battle between the primal urge to freeze, to curl into a ball and wait for a dawn that would never come, and the desperate necessity of their quest. It was Lindir who broke the stalemate. His voice, though thin with pain and fear, cut through the black. He spoke not of courage, but of memory. He began to recite, his words painting a map in the air. He described the layout of the great dwarven mansions from the oldest songs, the tales of the Longbeards and their hall of pillars, the turn toward the deep forges. His knowledge, once a thing of dusty scrolls and quiet contemplation, became their only torch. His decision to guide them, to force his injured mind to focus amidst the terror, was an act of profound courage. He became their eyes. Slowly, painfully, they began to move again, a chain of three, each with a hand on the shoulder of the one before. They inched forward, Lindir navigating by the feel of the carved walls under his fingertips, calling out obstacles in a steady, whispered monologue. Every shuffle of their feet was an agony of anticipation, every beat of their hearts a loud drum in the crushing quiet. They were utterly vulnerable, blind mice in a stone cage, their fate resting entirely on the accuracy of a half-remembered song. And then, from the abyssal depths far below, it came, a sound so faint it was felt more than heard, a distant, rhythmic vibration through the stone itself. Clink, pause, clink. It was the unmistakable sound of a hammer falling on an anvil, a single, lonely beacon ringing out in the absolute black. The rhythmic clink of the hammer was a lifeline, pulling them through the suffocating dark. They followed the sound, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that grew from a faint tremor in the stone to a clear, resonant chime, guiding them through vast, empty halls and down winding stairs hewn from the mountain's roots. The oppressive blackness began to soften, replaced by a faint, pulsing orange glow that stained the edges of the passage ahead. The air grew warm, then hot, carrying the scents of hot metal and ozone, the holy incense of a smithy. They emerged not into a tomb, but into a cavernous chamber that stole their breath. This was the last forge of the West, a place of terrible, beautiful power. A great anvil stood upon a dais, and above it, a vein of raw, molten light streamed from the ceiling, a captured piece of the heart of the world itself, focused into a pure, white-hot flame. And there, standing within that radiance, was Celebrimbor. He was not a broken fugitive, but a figure of terrifying concentration, his form silhouetted against the forge fire, his hands moving with an ancient, precise grace as he worked a shimmering substance on the anvil. He was channeling the very last of his spirit, his own innate light, into the artifact taking form under his hammer. Each strike was a whisper of power, a piece of his soul being folded into the metal. The consequence of their arrival was a moment of stunned, silent revelation. Elrond saw the truth, and his heart split in two. Celebrimbor's goal was not selfish, but utterly selfless, a final, desperate act of creation to preserve the memory, the songs, the very essence of their people in a vessel that could outlast the fading of the world. It was a Silmaril of spirit, just as the Ent had said, a sanctuary for all they were. This noble, beautiful goal now stood in direct opposition to Elrond's duty. His purpose was to bring the smith to safety, to save a life, but to demand Celebrimbor abandon his work now, to stop when he was so close to completion, was to demand he forsake the very legacy Elrond had come to preserve. The central conflict was no longer about finding a lost elf, but about the soul of their race itself. Was their legacy the survival of a few individuals escaping to a distant shore? Or was it this, a final, magnificent act of sacrifice, pouring their last light into a creation that would stand as a beacon for all time? Elrond had to choose. He stepped forward, his voice raw with strain, and spoke the words he was sworn to say. He spoke of the ship, of the gray havens, of the peace that waited across the sea. Celebrimbor did not even look up from his work. His eyes, when he finally raised them, burned with a feverish, fading light, a star in its final, brilliant moments before collapse. He refused. His voice was quiet, yet it filled the colossal chamber. "I am not making a trinket of power," he said. "I am building a tombstone for our entire civilization, and I will be the last one to lay a flower upon it. To leave now would render every sacrifice, every moment of pain, utterly meaningless. My life is the final ingredient." The philosophical stakes were absolute, and Elrond stood at their precipice, his quest's purpose unraveling before the blinding truth of the Creator's passion. The forge's glow could not warm the cold division that fell between them. Galdor's face was a mask of hard, sea-weathered pragmatism. Our mission was to save a life, he argued, his voice tight. Not to witness a suicide. We were sent to bring him home, not to guard his tomb. Every instinct in him, honed by centuries of navigating tangible dangers, revolted against this abstract, desperate gamble. He saw only the certain loss of their last chance for peace, a squandering of their final strength on a creation that might shatter the moment it was finished. But Lindir stood transfixed, his eyes reflecting the artifact's nascent light. "He is not building a tomb," he whispered, his voice trembling with a scholar's awe. "He is building a library of souls. Every song I thought lost, every story, every memory, he is offering them a sanctuary. To abandon this is to truly let our people fade." This was no longer a simple quest. It was a schism of the spirit, a battle between the duty to survive and the duty to be remembered. Their heated counsel echoed in the vast chamber, a clash of two irreconcilable truths. Galdor, the mariner, saw a doomed ship on a fatal reef, and his purpose was to haul the crew back to safety. Lindir, the lore master, saw the last great epic being written, and believed their only purpose was to ensure its final page was not torn out. The unity that had carried them through darkness and mountain shattered against this impossible choice. The conflict was no longer with ghosts or goblins, but within their own small company, and the fracture felt more dangerous than any external threat. All eyes turned to Elrond. He was their leader, the one who had borne the weight of ancestral failure and guided them through despair. Now he had to make a sovereign decision, a choice that would define not just their fate, but the very meaning of their legacy. He looked from Galdor's desperate, angry face to Lindir's hopeful, fragile one, and finally to Celebrimbor, who had already poured so much of himself into the shimmering form on the anvil that he seemed half a ghost already. Elrond's own heart was torn, but in that moment he understood a terrible truth. The voyage to the Grey Havens was an escape, a preservation of the individual. What Celebrimbor attempted was a preservation of the whole. To save the smith's life now would be to kill the very soul of their people. His voice, when it came, was quiet but absolute, a note of finality that silenced the argument. "We do not abandon him," Elrond said. "We stand with him. We will see this work finished." The consequence of his choice was immediate and profound. They were no longer rescuers, they were guardians. They had committed their own fading strength, their last reserves of spirit, to a creation that burned like a beacon in the unseen world. The stakes escalated from a personal quest to a cosmic gamble. This much concentrated power, this desperate act of defiance against the natural order, would not go unnoticed. Dark things that fed on light and hope would be drawn to this place, sensing a feast of unimaginable potency. Galdor, his face a storm of resignation, gave a curt, grim nod. He would follow his lord even into this. The Forge's defense began not with shouts, but with a grim, shared silence, as they turned from the glorious light of creation to face the encroaching shadows it was certain to attract. The very stone of the mountain groaned in protest. A deep, resonant tremor shook the chamber, sending fine dust sifting down from the ceiling in a gray rain. It was not the rhythmic pulse of the forge, but a sickening, irregular shudder, the sound of foundations shifting under an impossible weight. The air, already thick with heat, grew heavy with a new and foul perfume, the reek of sulfur and an ancient, waking malice that had slept in the dark for ages beyond counting. Their beacon of creation had been seen, The shadow was answering their light. Galdor was the first to react, his sword leaping into his hand as he moved to the chamber's single, vast entrance, his face grim. "We have drawn a hunter from the deep," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is no goblin scrabble. This is Durin's Bane." The name itself was a curse, a legend of utter destruction. This was a conflict that made their struggles with ghosts and goblins feel like child's play. They were no longer fighting for a clue or a path. They were facing a primordial force of shadow, a being of pure flame and ruin that had helped topple empires. The tremors grew stronger, closer, a dreadful, plodding rhythm that promised annihilation. In the face of this, Celebrimbor did not falter. He did not even look up from the anvil. His eyes, burning with a frantic, desperate light, remained locked on the artifact. His hands moved faster, the hammer falling in a frantic, accelerating rhythm. The melody of its creation, once a stately, powerful hymn, became a frantic, discordant shriek of power. He was forcing the process, pouring the dregs of his spirit into the work with a reckless haste. The consequence was immediate. The artifact, a vessel meant to hold the gentle light of memory, began to pulse with a jagged, unstable brilliance. Fine, hairline fractures, invisible to the eye, but felt in the spirit, spider-webbed through its essence. To achieve perfection required time and patience, a slow, careful layering of power. But time was a luxury the mountain was no longer willing to give them. Celebrimbor's choice was one of terrible obsession. He would rather risk a flawed, broken masterpiece than see his life's work, the last hope of his people, extinguished before it was even born. He was gambling the soul of their legacy against the approaching shadow. The stakes were no longer about survival or even memory. It became a battle for the very nature of light itself. Could a thing born of such frantic fear and desperate haste ever truly hold peace? Or was it doomed to become just another beautiful, tragic echo in the dark? A monument not to preservation, but to final, absolute loss. The deep tremor became a deafening roar as the creature filled the entrance. It was not a beast of flesh and bone, but a being of living shadow and flame, a tempest of hatred given form. Its presence was a physical weight, a suffocating dread that sought to extinguish the very hope in their hearts. This was Durin's Bane, and its wrath was the end of all things. The elves did not have a strategy, only an instinct. Their defense was a desperate harmony of three distinct strengths. Galdor, with a roar that defied the terror, met the shadow with his sword, his blade a silver arc against the darkness. He did not seek to kill the impossible, but to hold the line, to create a precious margin of space and time. He became the rear guard, a solitary rock against a tide of fire, his every parry a costly expenditure of his own dwindling spirit. While Galdor fought, Lindir did not look at the monster. His eyes were screwed shut, his mind racing through millennia of forgotten lore, through songs of the valor and tales of the first darkness. He was not seeking a weapon, but a memory, a flaw in the ancient design of such beings. He shouted over the cacophony, his voice thin and strained. Its fire is a shield, a manifestation of its will. The shadow is its substance. The conflict was a spectacular, draining clash of opposing energies. The Balrog's fiery whip lashed out, and Galdor's blade met it not with steel alone, but with a surge of his own inner light, a searing white flash that cost him dearly with each impact. He was burning his soul to buy them seconds. Lindir, his face pale with concentration, cried out a single, resonant word in the primordial language of creation, a syllable of unbinding. The Balrog faltered for a heartbeat, its form flickering, the shadow around it recoiling as if from a sudden, piercing cold. The consequence was a violent backlash. The creature's attention, its full, incandescent hatred, swung from the warrior to the scholar. A wave of pure psychic force slammed into Lindir, throwing him back against the anvil and silencing his song. In that moment of shattered defense, Elrond made his choice. He could not match the Balrog's raw power, but he could stand against its terror. He stepped forward, placing himself between the falling Lindir and the advancing shadow. He did not raise a weapon. He stood firm, and from him flowed not an attack, but a declaration. It was a field of pure, calm resolve, a bastion of memory and purpose that pushed back against the crushing despair. It was the memory of starlight on the water, of the first sunrise, of a mother's lullaby. His decision to embody hope itself, to become an anchor for his companions, was what truly inspired them. Galdor, on his knees, found the strength to rise again. Lindir, gasping, clutched his chest and tried to find his voice, but the cost was absolute. By making himself the focal point of this spiritual war, Elrond drew the Balrog's wrath directly upon himself. The creature's gaze fixed on him, and it understood that this light, this stubborn, defiant hope, was the true enemy. The stakes escalated beyond survival. The chamber itself could no longer contain such a concentration of opposing forces. With a world-shattering blow of its whip, the Balrog struck not at the elves, but at a great, central pillar of stone that supported the mountain's weight above them. The pillar exploded into fragments. A rain of colossal stone blocks began to fall, and the very ceiling of the last forge of the West started its inexorable, grinding collapse. The final, perfect note of the hammer fell, and a silence more profound than the mountain's collapse swallowed all sound. Celebrimbor's hand stilled upon the artifact, a luminous crystal that now blazed with an inner constellation of captured memories, songs, and sorrows. It was the heart of memory, and it was complete. In that final, transcendent act of creation, as he poured the last dregs of his own spirit into the vessel, his physical form could no longer bear the cost. He did not cry out. He simply unraveled, his body dissolving into a shower of silver motes that spiraled once around the glowing heart before being drawn into its core. The Creator had become a part of his creation, a soul now bound within the very legacy he had sought to preserve. The moment was a tragic victory, a beautiful and terrible success that left the survivors hollow with grief, even as they beheld their people's salvation. Elrond's heart screamed in a silent conflict between the devastating loss of his friend and the crushing weight of the duty now left undone. There was no time to mourn. The enraged bellow of the Balrog shook the crumbling chamber, its fiery gaze locking not on the elves, but on the newly completed heart, an object of pure, concentrated light that was an offense to its very nature. The crystal pulsed, and a wave of soft, adamant light pushed against the darkness, forcing the shadow back a single step. It was a momentary reprieve, a single, stolen breath in the chaos. Elrond's decision was pure instinct, a lunge born of necessity. His hand closed around the heart of memory. The moment his fingers touched the warm crystal, the burden transferred. He felt the weight of 1,000 lives, 1,000,000 memories, the entire song of the elven people settle upon his spirit. And with that burden, he inherited the Balrog's undivided hatred. He was no longer just a lord or a healer. He was the guardian, the sole protector of a world's soul, and the primary target for the apocalypse descending upon them. Galdor saw the truth of their situation in a single, searing instant. The heart of memory was complete, Elrond its new guardian, and the mountain was coming down upon them. There was no path to victory, only a choice of endings. With a final roaring cry that was part sea shanty and part war song, the mariner turned and charged not away from the Balrog, but directly toward it. He met the creature on a slender arch of stone that spanned a bottomless chasm, a bridge that was their only escape route. He knew his silver blade could not slay a demon of the ancient world. His goal was not to win, but to occupy. He became a wall of flesh and spirit, a final, desperate obstacle. Every parry of his sword against the creature's whip of fire cost him, the searing heat blistering his skin and scorching the very light from his eyes, but he gave not an inch of ground. His sacrifice was not a quiet surrender, but a furious, defiant storm, holding the line long enough for Elrond and the wounded Lindir to stagger past. The last thing they saw was Galdor, silhouetted against the hellish glow, driving the point of his sword into the stone of the bridge itself, anchoring his body as a final, unyielding bulwark. Then the world broke. The Balrog's wrath came down in a cataclysm of flame and shadow, and the bridge, along with the noble soul upon it, shattered into the abyss. The thunderous roar of collapsing stone chased them as they fled, a sound that would echo in their minds forever. There was no time for grief, only the raw, animal need for survival, their lungs burning in the dust, choked air as they scrambled through shaking tunnels. When they finally stumbled into the cold, clean air of the eastern foothills, collapsing onto the stony ground, the silence was a physical shock. They were two, where there had been three. The grief for Galdor was a sharp, new weight added to the heavy burden of the heart Elrond carried. It was not a soft sorrow, but a hard, cold thing that forged their resolve in a crucible of loss. The mariner's choice had transformed their mission. They were no longer a company on a quest. They were the last custodians of a legacy, their number and their strength cut in half. Elrond looked at Lindir, who leaned against a boulder, his face pale and etched with the memory of their flight, and then he looked down at the luminous crystal in his hand. He felt the lives within it, the memories, the song of the sea that Galdor had loved. To honor that sacrifice, there could be no more hesitation, no more doubt. The path ahead was darker and more perilous than ever, but the cost of turning back was now unthinkable. Every step forward would be a tribute to the friend they had left in the dark. The heart of memory was a world in his palm. Its weight was not of crystal, but of 1,000 lifetimes of joy and sorrow, pressing directly upon Elrond's spirit. He felt Celebrimbor's will woven into its core, a fierce, desperate love for their people that now flowed into his own mind like a second tide of thought. At first, it was a comfort, a shared purpose, but soon the whispers began. He would look at a familiar star and see it through Celebrimbor's eyes, remembering a forge under its light that he himself had never visited. The scent of rain would bring him a memory of a lost love that was not his own. The artifact was not a passive vessel. It was a living, breathing presence, and it sought a singular voice to speak with. Elrond found himself fighting a silent, internal war, struggling to recall the timbre of his own memories against the overwhelming chorus from the heart. Was his grief for Galdor his own, or was it an echo of Celebrimbor's grief for his entire house? The line between bearer and artifact began to blur, and a chilling fear took root, the fear of dissolution, of becoming merely a new shell for an old, powerful ghost. He could not carry this alone. One evening, as they took shelter in a shallow cave, Elrond saw Lindir watching him with a scholar's piercing understanding. "You are fighting it," Lindir said softly, his voice still weak but clear. "You try to hold it at a distance, like a shield, but such a thing cannot be carried like a burden. It must be carried like a song." The truth of it struck Elrond with the force of a revelation. His attempt to bear the entire weight himself was a form of arrogance, and it was allowing the heart's singular voice to dominate. His decision was one of profound trust. He did not hand the crystal to Lindir. Instead, he opened his own spirit, creating a bridge, and let the river of memory flow between them. The consequence was immediate and overwhelming for Lindir. He gasped, his eyes widening as the full, unfiltered history of their people flooded into him. But where Elrond had resisted, Lindir did what he had always done. He listened. He began to hum, a low, stabilizing melody, and as he did, the chaotic torrent of memories began to find a harmony. His own knowledge of songs and stories acted as a filter, giving the raw emotion of the heart a structure, a rhythm it had lacked. The pressure on Elrond's mind eased, the foreign memories receding from the forefront of his thoughts. In that shared space, their bond was reforged not as lord and follower, but as two pillars supporting a single, immense arch. Yet this act revealed the artifact's true, dangerous nature. It was not merely a repository, it was sentient, and it hungered for connection. It had tried to merge with Elrond, and now it had two minds to weave its influence upon. The stakes were now infinitely higher, for if either of them faltered, the heart would not simply be lost, it would consume them both. They finally stumbled out from the shadow of the mountains into a dawn so brilliant it felt like a physical blow. The clean, sharp air of the open lands was a shock after the deep, suffocating darkness of Khazad-dûm. Elrond looked at his own hands, half expecting to see the soot of the forge still upon them, and then at Lindir, whose face was now etched with a wisdom and a sorrow far beyond his years. They were not the same elves who had entered the mountain. They had left a part of themselves in the dark, with Galdor and with Celebrimbor, and had gained a burden that was both a miracle and a curse. The world before them was green and vast, but their journey felt heavier than ever, for the greatest enemy was no longer a monster of shadow, but the luminous, sentient legacy they now carried together. The dawn's brilliance was a lie, a fleeting moment of peace before the true nature of their flight revealed itself. The heart of memory was a beacon, and every shadow in the land now stirred, drawn to its light. What began as a journey became a gauntlet. They were harried by things with too many legs and no eyes, by patches of moving darkness that blighted the grass where they passed, by whispers on the wind that carried the scent of decay. There was no rest, only a state of perpetual, grinding vigilance that wore at the edges of their souls. The consequence was a slow, insidious erosion. Hope, that resilient flame, began to gutter under the constant, cold drip of fear. The very land seemed to conspire against them, with streams turning brackish where they sought to drink and familiar stars hiding behind a perpetual thin haze. The conflict was a brutal arithmetic of endurance, their own fading strength measured against a relentless, mindless pursuit. It was Lindir who first understood they could not simply outrun the shadows. One evening, as they crouched in a thicket, watching a pack of wargs sniff the air where they had stood an hour before, the lore master's eyes lost their distant, scholarly look and grew sharp, calculating. He began to trace routes not on a map of known paths, but on a map of misdirection. He used his deep knowledge of ballads and histories not for comfort, but for tactics. He remembered an old lay about a phantom army that marched along a certain riverbed to mislead a dark lord, and he proposed they do the same, leaving heavy footprints and scraps of cloth along a false trail leading north while they slipped away east. His decision to embrace cunning over pure flight marked a profound transformation. The quiet scholar was becoming a desperate, brilliant strategist. This new path was a desperate race, not just against the creatures at their heels, but against time itself. Every clever ruse, every backtrack through a stream to hide their scent, cost them precious hours and shreds of their remaining energy. The stakes were no longer about mere survival, but about the integrity of the burden they carried. If they fell, the heart would not be lost to the darkness. It would be consumed by it, its beautiful light twisted into a new kind of weapon for the shadow. Each day, the sea felt more like a childhood dream than a destination, a receding myth on a horizon they could no longer see. Their journey had become a test of wit against instinct, a fragile dance where a single misstep by the new strategist would mean the end of everything. The whispering began in their dreams, but soon it bled into the waking world. A patch of sunlight on the grass would twist into the face of a fallen comrade. The sigh of the wind would carry a forgotten lullaby, and the scent of pine would become the cloying perfume of a long-dead garden in Gondolin. The heart of memory was no longer a burden they carried. It was an atmosphere they breathed, and it began to paint the world with the ghosts of their own pasts. For Lindir, it was a cascade of failures. Every song he had ever sung imperfectly now echoed back at him. Each wrong note a screaming dissonance that accused him of unworthiness. He saw libraries of ash, scrolls crumbling to dust under his touch, and he would suddenly stop on the trail, his hands over his ears, weeping for knowledge he believed he had let die. His strategic mind, their only shield against the physical pursuit, began to fray under this psychological siege. The internal conflict was a war on two fronts, the tangible shadows at their heels and the intangible ones in their minds, and the latter threatened to be far more deadly. Elrond watched as the artifact tested them, probing for cracks in their resolve. It showed him Celebrimbor's final, agonized moments over and over, not as a memory, but as an accusation. Was your quest worth my sacrifice? The vision seemed to scream. Did you come for me, or only for the prize I forged? The weight of his choice at the Grey Havens felt like a millstone around his neck, and for a terrifying moment, he saw the entire journey as an arrogant, selfish folly that had cost good elves their peace. The crisis of faith reached its peak on the third night of these waking dreams. Lindir stood at the edge of a cliff, not seeing the drop, but staring into a vision of the Grey Havens, the last ship, a golden speck on the horizon. He took a step forward, toward that illusion of peace, his body ready to follow his broken spirit into the abyss. In that moment, Elrond made his choice. He did not shout or grab him. Instead, he sat upon the ground, closed his eyes, and began to sing. It was not a song of power, but a simple, quiet melody from his own childhood, a song his mother had sung, untouched by the grand tragedies of their history. He poured the last dregs of his own, untarnished spirit into the notes, creating a small, calm center in the raging storm of their shared consciousness. He became an anchor, a single, steady point of light in the psychic chaos. The consequence was a further, visible depletion. As Lindir slowly turned from the cliff edge, his eyes clearing as he grasped the lifeline of that simple song, Elrond seemed to age centuries. His shoulders slumped, and the vibrant light that had once defined him now clung to his form like the last embers of a dying fire. He had given yet another piece of his own essence to hold his companion together. This act proved his true role, not as a lord or a warrior, but as a unifier of spirits, the one who could bear the fractures of others when they could not bear themselves. It also revealed the terrifying truth of the artifact. The Heart of Memory was not a passive tool, it was a judge. It tested the worthiness of its bearers, and should they fail, its light would turn inwards and consume them. They pressed on the next morning, their bodies moving forward by sheer habit, their sanity hanging by the fragile thread of Elrond's sacrifice. The forest floor finally gave way under their feet, not into a chasm, but into a circle of torchlight and wary, human faces. They had stumbled, half-blind with exhaustion and haunted minds, into a hidden enclave of the Rangers of the North. The men moved with a quiet lethality that spoke of a life spent on the edge of survival, their cloaks the color of the forest floor, their eyes sharp and assessing. They did not attack, but their hands rested on the hilts of their swords, a silent question hanging in the cold night air. Then one of them, a young woman with a hunter's gaze, pointed a trembling finger not at the elves, but at the soft glow emanating from the pack where the Heart of Memory was hidden. She whispered a single word, a name from their oldest legends, Gil Estel, the Star of High Hope. In that moment, the conflict shifted from one of survival to one of belief. The Rangers saw in the artifact's light a sign they had been taught to watch for, a promise from a forgotten age. For the elves, it was a profoundly uncomfortable revelation. Their most desperate burden was another race's sacred symbol. The cultural divide was a chasm you could feel. The Rangers lived by the harsh, practical code of the wild, their lives measured in brief, brutal seasons. The elves were creatures of millennia, their thoughts on the slow fading of an entire people. The Rangers offered food, warmth, and protection, a sanctuary they could not refuse, but it came with a price. It was an alliance of necessity, fragile and tense, built on a foundation of ancient myth and present desperation. Around a low fire, the Ranger captain, a grim man named Halbarad, with eyes that had seen too much, laid out the terms of their aid. He would guide them through the wilds, but he demanded to know what they carried and why the shadows of the world were hunting them. Elrond faced his choice in the flickering light. To lie or withhold the truth was to insult the trust of these mortals and risk the alliance crumbling when they most needed it. But to reveal the full, terrifying scope of their quest was to tie the fate of these short-lived men to an immortal struggle, to a war against a fading that they could scarcely comprehend. It was a decision that would pull mortals into a conflict that was never meant for them, escalating the stakes from the salvation of a memory to a battle involving all the free peoples of the world. Elrond looked at Lindir, who gave a slow, weary nod, and then at the hopeful, hardened faces of the Rangers. He saw not soldiers for a cosmic war, but protectors of the simple, tangible world of dawn and dusk. And he knew his duty. He began to speak, his voice low and heavy with the weight of ages. He told them of the Grey Havens, of the final ship, and of the choice to turn away from peace. He spoke of Celebrimbor's sacrifice in the deep dark, and of the heart that now held the soul of the elven race. He did not soften the truth. He explained that by helping them, the Rangers were making an enemy of the ancient shadow that sought to extinguish this last light forever. The consequence was a profound, sobering silence. Halbar had stared into the fire for a long time, the fate of his people and the weight of legend warring in his mind. Finally, he looked up, his decision made. He spoke not of glory or destiny, but of a simple human duty. If this light is a thing of hope, then it is worth protecting, he said. Our struggle has always been for the dawn. Your war is now our war. The alliance was sealed, but the cost was a shared burden. The elves were renewed, their bodies strengthened by food and rest, but their spirits now carried the added responsibility for the mortal lives they had just entangled in their fate. As they prepared to leave the sanctuary at first light, the journey felt different. They were no longer two lone fugitives carrying a secret. They were the vanguard of a fragile, newfound hope, walking into a final leg of the journey that would decide the fate of more than just the elves. The scent of salt on the wind was a cruel promise, a hint of home that only made the pain of their flight more acute. The Rangers led them on a brutal, forced march, moving only under the cover of darkness through treacherous, forgotten paths. There was no walking, only a relentless, stumbling run that blurred one night into the next. It was a physical war against their own bodies, a conflict where the enemy was exhaustion, the cold, and the sharp stones that tore at their feet. The Rangers, hardened by their harsh lives, began to falter first, their mortal frames pushed far beyond their natural limits. Elrond moved among them like a ghost himself, his own light so dim it was barely a flicker. He would press a hand to a heaving shoulder, or whisper a single, sustaining word, and a ranger would find the strength for 10 more steps. He was spending the very last dregs of his spirit, not to fight a monster, but to mend blistered feet and soothe burning lungs, a decision that cemented his role as the heart of their desperate company, even as it hollowed him out from within. The consequence was a terrifying erosion. With every spark of energy he gave to another, his own form grew more translucent, more like a memory of an elf than a living being. He was a candle burning at both ends, and the wax was nearly gone. Just as the first true light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, a ranger scout slipped back to the main group, his face grim. He did not need to speak. The distant, guttural howls that answered the morning wind said everything. The enemy's vanguard was on their heels, and the sea was still a day's run away. They were trapped between the hope of the shore and the reality of the closing shadow, their leader almost extinguished, with nowhere left to run. The salt spray stung their eyes, a bitter taste of the sea that now lay just beyond a wall of shifting, spectral forms. The beach was not their sanctuary, but a killing ground. Dozens of wraiths, their bodies like smoke-given malice, swarmed over the single, graceful elven ship, anchored just beyond the breakers, their claws scraping against the hull in a chorus of pure hatred. The Balrogs will reach from beyond the abyss, and this was its final, spiteful gambit. The Rangers did not hesitate. With a unified cry that was more a snarl of defiance than a cheer, they charged into the fray, their steel swords flashing against insubstantial foes. But mortal blades passed through the wraiths like mist, doing little more than stirring their forms. The elves' own fading light was their only true weapon, and with every burst of silver energy to force a wraith back, Elrond and Lindir grew paler, more translucent. The consequence was a brutal stalemate, a war of attrition they were destined to lose, their very souls being burned as fuel for a defense that could not last. The ship, their only means of escape, was being torn apart plank by plank, and with it, the final hope for the Heart of Memory. Elrond watched the line of Rangers break and reform, their mortal courage a heartbreaking contrast to their ineffectual blades. He saw Lindir, standing back to back with him, his song of power now a ragged, gasping whisper as he tried to keep the encroaching shadows at bay. The conflict was no longer about survival, but about the nature of their legacy. To fight to the last here was a noble end, but it was an end. It would mean the heart and all the souls within it would be extinguished on this shore, a final, beautiful failure. The only path to victory was a terrible, surgical amputation of their own company. His decision was a fracture in his own heart. He grabbed Lindir by the shoulder, his touch startlingly cold. "You must take the heart," he said, his voice cutting through the cacophony of battle. "You must go now." Lindir's eyes widened in protest, but Elrond's gaze was absolute. "I will hold them here. I will be the shore upon which this darkness breaks." The choice was a definition of roles of sacrifice. Lindir was the vessel, the keeper of the song. Elrond would become the final, immovable note in that song's defense. He was not asking for permission, he was giving a final command. As Lindir, clutching the glowing heart to his chest, turned and began a desperate sprint toward the small boats at the water's edge, Elrond turned to face the tide. He planted his feet in the wet sand and let the last of his power flow out of him. It was not a weapon, but a wall. A shimmering, silver barrier of pure will erupted from him, a tangible force that stretched across the beach, halting the advancing wraiths as if they had struck a cliff of glass. The consequence was both magnificent and horrifying. The pressure against the barrier was immense, 1,000 claws of hatred scrabbling against his mind. He could feel every impact, every shred of malice, as if it were his own flesh being torn. He was the anchor, and he was being pulled apart. The Rangers, seeing their chance, rallied to him, forming a living bulwark around his trembling form, their bodies a second, mortal wall against the psychic storm. The tide of battle turned on this single, precarious point. Every second Elrond held was a second Lindir gained, rowing through the choppy, dark water toward the besieged ship. The wraiths, enraged by the proximity of the heart, threw themselves against the barrier with renewed fury, and fine cracks, visible only in the spirit, began to web their way across its surface. Elrond's form flickered, a star in its last moment of brilliance, before the final, inevitable dark. The silver wall splintered, its light fracturing into 1,000 dying shards. Each wraith that threw itself against the barrier was a hammer blow to Elrond's soul, and with every impact, a piece of his ancient spirit was chipped away and scattered on the salt-stung wind. The Rangers, understanding the terrible arithmetic of the moment, did not try to fight the impossible. Instead, they locked their shields, forming a second, mortal wall in front of the Elf Lord, their bodies a final, desperate bulwark against the tide. They were buying seconds with their lives, a brutal exchange of flesh and blood for the sliver of time Lindir needed to reach the ship. Elrond felt the last of his strength, bleeding out of him, a river flowing into a sea of nothingness. He was a vessel being emptied, and the emptiness that rushed in was cold and absolute. His choice was no longer a matter of strategy, but of essence. To hold the line for one more breath, he had to pour the very core of who he was into the failing light. He gave it all, not in a glorious surge, but in a final, quiet release. The consequence was both beautiful and horrifying. The barrier blazed with the incandescent white of a dying star, so brilliant it forced the wraiths to recoil, hissing in frustration. For 3 more heartbeats, the beach was held. In that fleeting, purchased moment, a single cry echoed from the ship, a signal that the heart of memory was safe. But as the last echo faded, so did the light. It did not vanish with a bang, but with a sigh, flickering once, twice, and then winking out of existence. The wall was gone, the last of Elrond's spirit, spent as the final coin in a desperate bargain, left him. He did not fall. He simply unraveled. His form dissolved into a soft, silver mist that hung for a moment over the sand where he had stood, a final, gentle exhalation before the wind took it, scattering the last of the half-elven lord across the waves he would never cross. On the deck of the departing ship, Lindir felt the severing, a sudden, hollow silence in a place that had always held the echo of a steadfast presence. He did not need to look back to know what had happened. The cost of their victory was absolute, paid in the currency of a soul. The ship caught the wind, pulling away from the darkened shore, carrying the living memory of a people and the ghost of the one who had ensured it would endure. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but the presence of an answered question. The wraiths were gone, not slain, but unmade, their shadowy forms dissolved by a light too pure for them to endure. The beach itself seemed cleansed, the very sand glowing with a soft, silver luminescence that mirrored the starlight above. Where Elrond had stood, there was now only a gentle, lingering warmth and a profound sense of peace. His sacrifice was not a defeat, but a transformation. He had not merely died, he had become the final, perfect note in the song he was sworn to protect, his own spirit woven into the fabric of the heart of memory. The quest's purpose was fulfilled in the most absolute way imaginable, the leader becoming the very foundation of the legacy he saved. On the ship, Lindir felt the change not as a loss, but as a completion. The artifact in his hands no longer felt like a heavy burden, but like a living, breathing thing, a heart that now beat with a familiar, steadfast rhythm. Elrond was not within it, he was of it, his sacrifice having forged the final, unbreakable bond between the vessel and the souls it carried. The ship, now free of its spectral assailants, caught the western wind, its sails billowing as it turned its prow toward the undying lands. The journey was over, and a new one was beginning, carrying forward a light that had been paid for with the ultimate price. The waves whispered against the hull, a timeless rhythm that now carried the echo of a final, perfect silence. The western horizon drank the last of the shore's silver glow, and with it, the final echo of Elrond's presence. Lindir stood at the rail, the heart of memory a warm, living weight against his chest. He felt the ship turn, its course set irrevocably for the undying lands, but the journey ahead was no longer the one they had begun. An age had not just closed, it had dissolved into the air, and the burden of what remained settled squarely upon his shoulders. The grief was a physical pressure, a hollow ache where the steadfast presence of his lord had once been a constant guide. He was a lore master, a keeper of songs, not a leader of their people. How could a chronicler of history become the architect of its next chapter? The conflict between his profound sorrow and the immense duty now required of him was a silent war waged in his own heart. The other elves on the ship moved with a quiet, stunned reverence, their eyes occasionally drifting to him, waiting for a sign, for a word. They were adrift not just on the sea, but in purpose, their last link to the old world severed. Lindir's hand tightened around the heart. He felt the pulse of a million memories within it, and among them, a new, resonant note of absolute sacrifice. Elrond had not just given his life, he had given them a direction. To succumb to grief now would be to render that sacrifice meaningless. His decision was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, deliberate acceptance that began in the depths of his sorrow and rose with the resolve of one who finally understands his part in the song. He turned from the rail to face the small, grieving company. He did not speak of loss or of lordship. He simply began to sing. It was an old, simple melody of starlight on water, but he wove into it the new memory of a silver wall on a dark beach, of a final, selfless stand. His voice, once fragile, now carried the weight and timbre of their collective legacy. He was no longer just Lindir, the lore master. He had become the guardian, the living vessel for their hope. The ship sailed on into the dawn, its wake a shimmering path on the sea, a line drawn between a past that was now fully memory and a future that was, at last, beginning. The heart pulsed in rhythm with the ship's gentle sway, a soft, warm cadence against Lindir's chest. It was no longer a crystal of memory, but a living chronicle of sacrifice. When he closed his eyes, he did not just see Celebrimbor's forge fire. He felt Elrond's final, steadfast resolve, a wall of silver light against the darkness. He sensed Galdor's roaring defiance on the bridge, a storm of courage that would never be forgotten. The artifact held them all, their essences woven together into a tapestry of love and loss. This was the consequence of their impossible quest, a profound transformation of their grief. The sharp, aching sorrow did not vanish, but it was slowly annealed into a solemn, unbreakable pride. Their loved ones were not gone, they were preserved, their stories and their spirits now the very bedrock of their people's future. An internal conflict arose within the company, a quiet struggle between the desire to retreat into private mourning and the undeniable call to honor this new, shared legacy. Some elves wished only for the quiet peace of Valinor, to let the past rest, but Lindir understood that such peace would be a betrayal. He saw the choice with perfect clarity. To let this heart become a mere relic, a beautiful object of contemplation, was to let the sacrifices turn cold and distant. His decision was not one of leadership, but of stewardship. He would use the heart to teach. He would be its voice. Each evening as the ship sailed on, he would gather the elves and, with a hand upon the warm crystal, he would not merely recite history, he would let it live. He would channel a memory, and the deck would seem to fill with the scent of pine from the old forest, or the sound of a hammer ringing in the deep places of the world, or the feel of salt spray from a final, desperate stand on a dark shore. He did not tell them to be brave. He showed them what bravery had cost. He did not speak of love. He let them feel the love that had fueled a final, selfless act. This choice ensured that the memory of Middle-earth, in all its beauty and its pain, would never fade. It would be the foundation upon which they built their new life, a legacy not of what was lost, but of what had been so fiercely protected. The stakes of their existence were forever raised, for they carried not just their own spirits, but the soul of an entire age. And as the mists ahead began to part, a new light, ancient and undying, glimmered on the horizon. The light of Valinor did not fall upon them. It rose up from the land itself to meet their ship. It was a gentle, welcoming radiance, and as their vessel glided into a harbor of pearl and living crystal, they saw that they were not the last stragglers of a fading race. They were the first arrivals of a new kind. The elves waiting on the shore did not gaze upon them with pity, but with a profound, silent reverence. All eyes were drawn to the soft, steady glow emanating from Lindir's chest, a light that pulsed with a familiar, heartbreaking rhythm. The heart of memory was not a secret they had smuggled to safety. It was a banner announcing their passage through fire and shadow. The consequence of its presence was immediate and transformative. They were not greeted as refugees begging for sanctuary, but as heroes who had brought a piece of the world's soul back to its source. A deep and resonant voice, like the sound of the earth itself, spoke a welcome that was not a simple greeting, but an acknowledgement. It named the fallen. It spoke of Celebrimbor's obsession, of Galdor's valor, and of Elrond's ultimate sacrifice. In that moment, the long, painful journey was validated. Every loss, every moment of despair, was reframed not as failure, but as a necessary verse in a song that had now reached its final, perfect chord. Their place in the undying lands was not just granted, it was earned, cemented by the heavy, beautiful burden they carried. This resolution forced upon Lindir the final, formal act of his mission. He was no longer a messenger, but a high priest of memory. He had to present the heart to the valor, the powers of this world. This was not a mere handing over of an object. It was a decision that would complete the cycle, transforming the artifact from a guarded secret into a shared, mythic contribution for all who dwelled in this timeless realm. He stepped forward, and as he held out the crystal, he did not simply let it go. He spoke the story one last time, his voice weaving together the threads of courage, sorrow, and love that were now its eternal substance. The light within the heart swelled, and for a single, breathtaking moment, the faces of all who had been lost shimmered within its depths, not as ghosts, but as honored guests at a long-awaited homecoming. The central conflict of their entire ordeal, the desperate struggle between survival and legacy, was finally and absolutely resolved. They had chosen legacy, and in doing so, they had not just preserved the past, they had enriched the future of paradise itself. A new chapter for the Immortal Elves began, not with an ending, but with a sacred beginning, their history no longer a fading echo, but a living, breathing light in the heart of the undying lands. The gentle light of Valinor did not diminish the weight of the stories he carried. It gave them a home. Lindir became the keeper of tales, a living bridge between the lost world of Middle-earth and the timeless peace of the undying lands. His immortality was no longer a simple span of years, but a sacred vocation. He sat in groves of ever-blossoming trees, the heart of memory warm upon his lap, and he did not merely recite history, he gave it breath. For generations of elves born in paradise, he became the window to a world of struggle and sacrifice they would never know. He sang of Celebrimbor's hands, stained with forged soot and starlight, shaping a final hope from desperation and genius. He sang of Galdor, a mariner who traded the sea's horizon for a bridge of stone, his final roar a testament to unwavering loyalty. And always, he sang of Elrond, the lord who became a shield, whose spirit unraveled not into nothing, but into a permanent silver dawn. This was Lindir's quiet conflict, a peaceful war fought not with swords, but with melody. His enemy was the gentle, insidious erosion of time, the slow fading of detail that even an immortal memory can suffer. He dedicated himself to ensuring that no nuance was lost, no moment of courage softened into vague legend. The consequence of his devotion was the flawless preservation of a crucial, brutal, and beautiful chapter of elven history, a legacy that would have otherwise been swallowed by the sea and the shadow. This choice to embrace a life of quiet purpose, to become a vessel rather than a hero, brought him a profound and personal peace. It was the final, positive outcome of their harrowing quest, a resolution that solidified all the sacrifice into an unbreakable foundation. His voice, once strained with fear and grief, now wove seamlessly into the eternal music of Valinor, a new and essential chord in the song of the world. The world the Rangers returned to was the same, yet utterly transformed. The familiar forests and harsh hills were bathed in a new light, a soft, silver clarity that seemed to linger in the air long after the sun had set. It was not a visible glow, but a feeling, a warmth that settled in the chest and refused to fade. The men and women who had stood with Elrond on that final beach found their steps a little lighter, their hearts a little more resilient against the creeping despair of the wild. The consequence of their brief, brutal alliance was a subtle but permanent change within them, a blessing written not in words, but in the very fiber of their being. They aged with a slower grace, their eyes holding a spark of ancient starlight that had not been there before. The memory of the elf lord's sacrifice became a living thing among them, a story told not just around campfires, but felt in the quiet courage of a scout facing down a pack of wargs, or in the enduring hope of a mother singing to her child in the dark. This was the elves' final, unintended gift to Middle-earth, a piece of their own fading spirit, woven into the lineage of mortals, strengthening the forces of good not with armies, but with a quiet, enduring light. Halbarad, the ranger chieftain, felt the weight of this new reality more than anyone. He had looked into the abyss on that beach, and had seen it held back by a love greater than any fear. He could not simply return to the old ways of survival, of hiding in the shadows and reacting to the darkness. The elves were gone, but their hope remained, a seed entrusted to mortal hands. The conflict was internal, a choice between the known path of a scattered, defensive people and the daunting, hopeful road of building something new. To ignore this blessing was to let it wither, a beautiful but forgotten dream. To embrace it was to commit his people, and all who would come after them, to a higher, more dangerous purpose. His decision was made one evening as he watched his young son, a boy whose eyes already seemed to hold the echo of that silver shore, practice with a wooden sword. He would not let this light fade. He gathered the chieftains of the scattered Dunedain, and spoke not of war, but of guardianship. He declared that their role was no longer just to survive, but to cultivate the hope that had been so dearly bought. They would become the steadfast gardeners of that elven seed, protecting the lands not just from orcs and wolves, but from the slow decay of memory and the creeping shadow of forgetfulness. This choice marked the true beginning of a new lineage, a line of chieftains who would carry the memory of that sacrifice in their blood, raising the stakes for the entire mortal world. The future of men was now irrevocably tied to a legacy of light, a quiet promise made on a bloody shore that would one day, in a future age, help a king return to his throne. A new star bloomed in the vault of the heavens. It was not born of ancient fire or cosmic dust, but from the light of the heart of memory itself, kindled by the valor in their timeless halls and set high above the world. This was Gil-Estil, the star of high hope, reborn not as a memory, but as a living promise. Each night it shone, a silent, silver beacon visible to all in Middle-earth, a celestial answer to the question of whether such profound sacrifice could ever truly be lost. The consequence of this act was a mythic resolution that transcended the personal grief of Lindir or the lost company. It forced the entire elven race, from the highest lord in Valinor to the most humble wood elf still lingering in the mortal lands, to look up and acknowledge the full cost and staggering value of that final, desperate voyage from the Grey Havens. The star was not just a tribute, it was a judgment and a blessing, a permanent part of the cosmos that validated every moment of pain. By elevating the story to the very firmament, the powers transformed a tale of loss into an eternal legend, providing a closure so absolute it could be seen by every living thing. The light that fell from that star did not illuminate the physical world, but the hearts of those who saw it. For the elves in the undying lands, it was a reminder that their peace was purchased with a price, a humbling truth that wove a thread of solemn gratitude into their immortality. For the mortals below, the rangers and the common folk in their darkening world, it was an undying ember of hope, a sign that their struggles were witnessed and that courage, even when it seemed to fail, was never, ever in vain. The star's silent journey across the night sky became the final verse in the song, a perfect, unending note of resolution that promised no act of true love, no matter how desperate, would ever be forgotten. Generations later, the shores of Valinor shimmer with a different kind of light. It is not just the undying radiance of the land, but the collective glow of countless elves gathered in a crescent along the water's edge. Led by Lindir, whose form is now as much a part of the landscape as the ancient trees, they do not merely tell the story of the final voyage, they sing it. Their voices rise and fall in a harmony of immense complexity, a living tapestry of sound woven from memory itself. The melody resonates with the gentle pulse of the heart of memory, which rests at the center of the gathering and seems to call in answer to the silver star glimmering high above. This is no simple performance. It is a ritual of remembrance that has become the bedrock of their society. The consequence of this annual gathering is a profound, communal healing. Each note, each chord, acts as a balm for wounds that are millennia old, the shared act of singing reforging their unity, not as a people who escaped a dying world, but as a people who saved its soul. It is a peaceful resolution to a narrative once defined by conflict and loss, transforming tragedy into a source of enduring strength. Lindir's decision to institutionalize this ceremony forces every new generation, those elves who have known only peace, to learn the score and understand the weight behind every word. They must feel, in their own spirits, the cost of the peace they inherit. This ensures the story's emotional power never diminishes into a dry historical fact, its stakes eternally resolved not in forgetfulness, but in active, beautiful memory. When the final note of the song fades into the quiet lap of the waves, a profound silence hangs in the air, thick with the presence of all that was given. The song ends, but its echo remains, woven into the very wind and water, a permanent part of the world. The air itself tore. Where Elrond stood, the world fractured into two impossible truths. The ship, a vessel of gleaming white wood and promised peace, pulled away from the shore, carrying the heart of memory toward a dawn he would never see. And before him, the shrieking tide of wraiths clawed at the last, failing barrier of his will. He was the only thing left between the legacy of his people and absolute oblivion. To hold them for one more moment, he had to spend what he did not have. He reached not for power, but for the very substance of his being, the ancient, luminous spirit that had carried him through 6,000 years of sunrises and sorrows. He drew it forth, a final, searing breath of light, from a well that was now irrevocably dry. The silver wall blazed with the intensity of a newborn star, a silent, concussive wave of pure force that did not destroy the wraiths, but unmade them, unwinding their shadowy forms back into the harmless, forgotten echoes they truly were. The beach fell into a stunned, ringing silence, but the cost was absolute. With the last of his energy spent, the anchor that held Elrond to the physical world was severed. He did not fall, he simply let go. His form dissolved not into death, but into light, unraveling into a soft, silver mist that hung for a single, heartbreaking moment over the sand. A final, gentle exhalation of a soul that had given everything. The wind from the sea gathered the shimmering tendrils and carried them out across the waves, scattering the last of the half-elven lord into the starlit air, a permanent part of the world he had died to save. On the deck of the ship, Lindir felt the severing, a profound and hollow silence in a place that had always echoed with a steadfast presence. He did not need to look back. He clutched the warm crystal of the heart to his chest and knew, with a certainty that was both devastating and peaceful, that their leader's final duty was complete. The central conflict of their entire journey, the agonizing war between the desire for personal peace and the duty to their people, was resolved in the most absolute way possible. Elrond's choice at the Grey Havens to turn his back on the ship had found its ultimate, terrible, and beautiful conclusion. He had not just protected the legacy, he had become part of it, his sacrifice now woven into the very soul of the heart he carried. The final ship's wake faded into the horizon, a silver scar on the sea that slowly healed into seamless blue. In Valinor, the light was eternal, but it was the memory of that scar and the cost it represented that gave the radiance its true depth. The voyage was over, the heart of memory secure, yet its arrival marked not an ending, but a transformation of what it meant to be immortal. Lindir and the survivors did not simply return to an unchanged paradise. They carried with them a truth forged in loss, an understanding that the most enduring peace is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of meaning born from sacrifice. Elrond's choice on that dark shore became the foundational stone upon which they rebuilt their purpose. He had proven that an ending, willingly embraced for love of something greater, could be the most powerful beginning of all. The elves of Valinor now lived with a new consciousness, their immortality tinged with a solemn gratitude. The story of the final voyage was not a tale of something they had lost, but a vital part of what they had become. Lindir, once a follower, now stood as a guardian of this profound truth. He taught that the light they now enjoyed was not merely inherent, but was also reflected, amplified by the courage of those who had chosen to stand against the dark, so that others might remember what light looked like. How does a perfect world avoid becoming stagnant? It is by remembering the stories of those who fought for its perfection. The legacy of that final, heroic stand beyond the gray havens became the quiet heartbeat of their civilization, a constant, gentle reminder that eternity gains its beauty not from endless, untroubled days, but from the echoes of love and sacrifice that give it resonance and depth. The world of the elves was forever changed, not diminished by their losses, but immeasurably enriched, their paradise now illuminated from within by a light that had been paid for with the ultimate price, a legacy to illuminate all the ages to come.